In the final, desperate days of World War II, German High Command placed their last hope in a fortress not made of concrete or steel, but of water. For 2,000 years, the Rhine River had been Germany's sacred shield, a wide, churning moat that had turned back armies since the time of the Roman legions. In March of 1945, with the Reich crumbling, their generals were certain of one thing. No army could force a crossing against determined defenders. They had prepared for every possibility, every tactic, every kind of assault boat and pontoon bridge. But they never, ever planned for an American truck that could swim. This is the story of how a simple, almost unbelievable piece of American ingenuity didn't just cross a river. It broke the will of an entire army and hastened the end of the Third Reich. For the German soldiers dug in along the eastern bank, men like Oberst Wilhelm Steinberg, the situation felt grim, but not hopeless. His field notebook, found later by Allied forces, tells a story of confidence rooted in centuries of military doctrine. "The Americans have reached our sacred river," he wrote, "but they cannot cross. No army has ever forced the Rhine against determined German resistance without bridges." As artillery flashes lit up the western bank, German commanders saw exactly what they expected: the prelude to a classic, textbook river assault. They knew it would take the Allies days to mass their forces, to bring up vulnerable assault boats, and to begin the slow, painstaking work of building pontoon bridges. And every one of those potential crossing points was already zeroed in by their deadly 88mm guns. The river itself was their greatest ally, over 1,000 feet wide, with currents so swift they could tear a pontoon bridge to pieces. Their engineers had assured them the Rhine was impossible to cross without a fight. They were prepared to win. But just across that dark water, thousands of men from the U.S. Ninth Army, including the 30th Infantry Division, were preparing to do the impossible. Not by boat, and not by bridge. They were climbing aboard vehicles that German intelligence had seen before, but catastrophically misunderstood. They called them DUKWs, strange-looking trucks with boat-shaped hulls. Allied intelligence knew the Germans had spotted them in Normandy and Italy, but Wehrmacht analysts had dismissed them as nothing more than specialized landing craft, only useful for beach assaults. The idea that these swimming trucks could be used for river warfare was considered absurd. The entire mathematical certainty of the Rhine's defense, a certainty that had held for 2 millennia, was about to be shattered. And it wouldn't be by superior firepower, but by a piece of industrial ingenuity that German defenders simply could not imagine. If stories like this, about the quiet ingenuity that won the war, are important to you, a quick click on that subscribe button helps us keep these histories alive. The failure had begun months earlier in the sterile offices of German intelligence. General Gunther Blumentritt, a senior officer, would later admit to Allied interrogators that they had fundamentally misread America's capabilities. Reports from Sicily and Normandy mentioned these Schwimmwagen, but they were filed away as curiosities, another example of American excess, like their floating ice cream parlors and Coca-Cola battalions. They simply didn't take them seriously. Why would they? The German military mind, steeped in a tradition of beautifully engineered, specialized weapons, couldn't grasp the American philosophy. That philosophy wasn't born in a military lab, but out of a simple problem on a Massachusetts beach in 1942. A Coast Guard boat ran aground on a sandbar, and no truck could get through the sand and surf to rescue the crew. It was a minor incident, but it sparked an idea. An official from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, Palmer Putnam, teamed up with a yacht designer, Rod Stevens Jr., to imagine something new, a truck that didn't have to stop when it hit the water. They took the idea to General Motors in Pontiac, Michigan, who accepted the challenge on June 25, 1942. An astonishing 75 days later, the first prototype of the DUKW rolled out of the factory. It was a marvel of practicality. They took the chassis of their standard 2.5-ton truck, the workhorse of the Army, and wrapped it in a simple, watertight hull. The name itself, DUKW, came right from the GMC playbook. D for the 1942 design year, U for utility, amphibious body style, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. It was a parts bin special, a testament to getting the job done with what you had. But what truly made it a game-changer were two brilliant innovations. The first was something we take for granted in trucks today: a central tire inflation system. For the first time ever, a driver could adjust tire pressure on the move. By dropping the pressure down to just 10 pounds per square inch, the tires flattened out, giving them incredible traction on soft sand and mud. Then, back on a hard road, they could inflate them to 45 psi for highway speeds. It could go from a beach to a highway without missing a beat. The second was its simple propulsion in the water. A propeller, driven by the truck's own transmission, pushed it along at a respectable 5.5 knots. The rudder was linked to the steering wheel, so the driver steered it just like he would on land. There was no complex transition. You just drove down a bank, and once you started floating, you kept on driving. When Major General Jacob Devers saw the demonstration, he immediately understood its potential and ordered mass production. The initial order was for 2,000. By the end of the war, GMC had churned out over 21,000 of them, each one costing about $10,000, the price of 7 Jeeps. But as the Germans were about to learn, their value was priceless. Back on the Rhine, the German defenses were formidable only on paper. The elite parachute army that was supposed to hold the line had been bled white in earlier battles, losing 90,000 men. The replacements were the Volkssturm, old men and young boys, handed a captured rifle and an armband and told to defend the fatherland. Their morale was held together by one single belief, echoed in a letter from Feldwebel Otto Kraus, dated March 20th. The Americans are across from us now, thousands of them, but the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon could not cross the Rhine against opposition. They had destroyed every bridge, and their artillery at every possible crossing site registered. They believed they were ready. What they didn't know was that hidden in forests just miles from the river, the Allies had assembled the largest fleet of amphibious vehicles in history. Over 800 DUKWs were ready, each one meticulously inspected and loaded. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, who commanded an amphibious truck company, recalled the intense preparation. We knew this wasn't Normandy. The Rhine was about current, about exit points. We practiced on the Meuse River for 2 weeks, learning how the DUKWs handled in fast current. These weren't factory-fresh vehicles either. They'd been modified based on years of combat. Extra armor plating protected the driver. A .50 caliber machine gun was mounted on a ring for defense, and crucially, powerful bilge pumps had been installed that could handle water pouring in from small arms fire, allowing a DUKW to keep moving even if its hull was riddled with holes. The plan was audacious. Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company told his men something that must have sounded like science fiction. They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done. Use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle. Not support vessels, not supply carriers after the bridges were built, but the actual spearhead. Each DUKW would carry a full squad of riflemen, cross the river, drive right up the enemy bank, and drop the troops directly into their fighting positions. The sequential, step-by-step process of a river crossing, a process the Germans had studied for years, was about to be thrown out the window. At 5 p.m. on March 23rd, the sky erupted. The greatest artillery bombardment of the Rhine campaign began. Over 5,000 Allied guns, from light field pieces to massive 240mm howitzers, opened up in a continuous 4-hour barrage. A German observer reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling under the impact of thousands of shells per minute. Gefreiter Heinrich Müller, at an observation post, tried to count the muzzle flashes. "I stopped at 500, he wrote. It was like looking at a solid line of flame. Not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that made thought impossible. This was the softening up the Germans expected. It was terrifying, but it was familiar. They huddled in their bunkers and waited for the next predictable phase. But under the cover of that deafening roar and the deepening darkness, something entirely unpredictable was happening. At 9:00 p.m., the first DUKW slipped into the Rhine. American soldiers described the moment. We rolled down the bank, and suddenly we were floating. The American driver just kept driving like we were still on land, except now water was rushing past. The current was fierce, faster than they had practiced, running at nearly 5 knots. The drivers had to aim far upstream of their landing points, calculating the drift in the dark. Some were swept hundreds of yards off course, but it didn't matter. The DUKW's genius was that it didn't need a perfect landing zone. Any reasonably sloped bank would do. By 10 p.m., the first wave was across. On the German side, defenders strained their ears, listening for the sound of assault boats returning to the west bank to pick up the next wave. But they heard nothing but the endless artillery. They couldn't understand. Where was the second wave? The reason was simple. There was no need for a return trip. The DUKWs had simply driven up the eastern bank, found a path through the shell-torn landscape, and disappeared into the darkness. Their passengers, now fully armed infantrymen, were already flanking German positions, appearing from directions the defenders thought were impossible. As dawn broke on March 24th, the reports flooding into German headquarters were pure chaos. They were getting calls about enemy troops in battalion strength appearing miles inland. The neat, orderly bridgeheads they had planned to counterattack simply didn't exist. Instead, Allied forces were popping up everywhere, all at once. Hauptmann Karl Richter, commanding an 88 Minimik battery, radioed his headquarters in a panic. "Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat, enemy armor is behind our position. How did they get across? All bridges are destroyed." What Richter's men had seen wasn't tanks, but DUKWs, which had driven 3 miles inland to deliver mortars and anti-tank guns, bypassing the very strong points designed to stop an advance from the river. When the morning fog finally lifted, the true scale of the operation was laid bare. Hundreds of DUKWs were churning back and forth across the Rhine, not at a few designated points, but along a 22-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, an operations officer, wrote in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously." The German defensive plan, so carefully constructed, had been rendered obsolete overnight. The British Second Army combined the DUKWs with another amphibious vehicle, the LVT Buffalo, a tracked vehicle that could carry 30 men. By 8 a.m., just 11 hours into the assault, 3 full Allied divisions were on the eastern side of the Rhine, complete with their heavy weapons, ammunition, and supplies. And then at 10 a.m., the Germans' nightmare got worse. The sky filled with the roar of over 1,700 transport planes and 1,000 gliders. It was Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne drop in history. More than 16,000 American and British paratroopers began to descend from the sky. But again, the Allies broke the rules. Instead of dropping deep behind enemy lines, they landed just 6 miles from the river, within artillery range, designed to link up immediately with the amphibious forces. This coordination was devastating. A German officer, Oberleutnant Franz Weber, watched in disbelief. The sky turned black with aircraft. We thought this was the main assault, that the river crossings were diversions. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us, with their swimming trucks. The paratroopers weren't isolated. Within hours, DUKWs were driving right up to their positions, delivering ammunition and medical supplies. This had never happened before in an airborne operation. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne wrote about the moment he saw them. We were fighting for this crossroads when these weird-looking truck boats came driving up. The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo?" We thought we were hallucinating. It's these small, personal details that really paint the picture of the war. If you appreciate hearing them, letting us know in the comments helps us know what kind of stories you want to see more of. By noon on the 24th, German commanders finally understood. This wasn't just a new tactic. It was a revolution that invalidated every single one of their plans. The DUKW had compressed the entire vulnerable sequence of a river crossing: assault, consolidation, bridge building, supply buildup, into a single, continuous flow. There were no choke points to attack because there were no bridges. Allied logistics officers established what they called DUKW highways. Vehicles loaded with supplies on the west bank drove into the river, crossed, and drove directly to the front lines. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims reported, "We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any, just trucks driving through water." The psychological effect was just as powerful as the tactical one. Imagine being a German soldier, taught your whole life that the Rhine was your nation's soul and its strongest defense, only to see it treated like a puddle. Feldwebel Hermann Goetz wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Stories from the American side sound almost comical. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo was setting up a supply dump 3 miles inside Germany when a DUKW, still dripping wet, rolled up carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it in the duck, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were insane. In that moment, the Germans weren't just being defeated. They were being overwhelmed by a reality they couldn't comprehend. The sheer productive power of the United States was on full display. Germany, for all its engineering prowess, had developed its own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasserschlepper, or LWS. It was, in many ways, a superior machine. Better armored, with tracks for better off-road performance. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. But here's the crucial difference. Germany produced only about 18 of them in total. The LWS was a craftsman's project, requiring specialized parts and skilled labor. Each one cost 7 times as much as a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors was building DUKWs on the same assembly lines as their standard trucks, sharing engines, axle, and transmissions. They built over 21,000. While a German factory might spend a month building one perfect LWS, American factories churned out 180 good-enough DUKWs in the same amount of time, and good enough was more than enough to win the war. This difference in philosophy was everything. An American mechanic who knew how to fix a standard truck could fix a DUKW. Spare parts were everywhere. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to operate a DUKW in a few hours. The German vehicle required a highly trained, specialized crew. America's system was built for citizen soldiers. Germany's was built for professionals. On the Rhine, the citizen soldiers, backed by overwhelming numbers, were winning. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg, put it best after the war. He said, "The Allies perfected not just the art of warfare, but its industrial execution, turning mass production into a decisive weapon." By March 26, just 72 hours after the assault began, the German defensive front had utterly collapsed. The barrier that was supposed to hold for weeks was gone. DUKWs had made thousands of crossings, transported 18,000 troops, and moved 1,200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and even light armor that would have taken days to get across by traditional means. Artillery was being ferried across and was firing. From the East Bank, before German command even had confirmation that a crossing was happening. The counterattacks they planned were useless. When Panzer Brigade 106 tried to attack what they thought was a bridgehead, their war diary noted, "Found no bridgehead in traditional sense. Enemy forces distributed across 15 kilometers front with no apparent center. Swimming vehicles continuously reinforcing all points. Impossible to identify critical target. Attack failed with heavy losses." The human cost, while significant, was a fraction of what it would have been. Planners estimated that a traditional assault would have cost tens of thousands of Allied lives. Instead, total casualties for Operation Plunder were around 6,800. Even the medical system was revolutionized. Wounded soldiers were put in a DUKW on the battlefield and driven directly to a field hospital on the other side of the river, often reaching surgeons within an hour of being wounded, something unheard of in previous operations. The speed of the breakthrough had a cascading effect. With the Rhine defenses shattered, Allied armored divisions poured into Germany. The DUKWs, their amphibious job done, now served as regular supply trucks, keeping pace with the advancing tanks, carrying the fuel and ammunition needed to maintain the Blitz. The U.S. Ninth Army advanced rapidly in the days following an impossible pace if they had been forced to wait for a traditional supply chain to be established. It was on March 25th that Prime Minister Winston Churchill, against all advice, insisted on crossing the Rhine himself. He boarded an American landing craft and stood on the eastern bank for 30 minutes, with German shells still landing nearby. He understood the symbolism. The leader of Great Britain, standing on German soil that had been considered untouchable just days before. He reportedly picked up a handful of earth and simply said, "German soil." At last. His defiant gesture was made possible by the constant ferry of DUKWs and landing craft. A traditional crossing would have required shutting down a vital bridge. The message was clear. The Allies didn't just have a foothold, they owned the river. The news rippled across the remaining German forces. The myth of the Rhine was broken. Soldiers who had fought stubbornly for months began to surrender in droves. A captured German lieutenant, when asked how his unit had been bypassed so quickly, just pointed to a line of DUKWs and said, "We don't wait for bridges." The German commander who heard this, Hans von Luck, wrote in his memoir, "It was then I truly understood that Germany had lost more than a battle. We had lost an entire form of warfare." In Berlin, the news was received with finality. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary on March 26th, "The situation in the West has become impossible. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." Field Marshal Walter Model, whose Army Group B was now trapped, issued a final order releasing his soldiers from their oath. He committed suicide a few weeks later rather than surrender. The DUKW was quintessentially American. It wasn't the most elegant or the most technologically advanced, but it was practical, reliable, and there were thousands of them. It was a solution born from a can-do spirit and built by the industrial might of a nation fully mobilized for war. It proved that in the 20th century, victory often belonged not to the side with the best soldiers, but to the side with the best factories. After the surrender, the DUKW's mission changed. The same vehicles that carried soldiers into battle now carried food to starving civilians in flooded German towns. A former driver, Anthony DeMarco, remembered those final crossings. No shooting, no artillery, just a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the bank, hoping we had chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food. It was a fitting end for the ugly duckling that had helped win the war. It turned the impossible into the routine, and in the end, it helped turn enemies back into people who needed help. The story of the DUKW is a powerful reminder that sometimes the simplest ideas, when backed by unstoppable will and industrial power, can change the course of history. It wasn't a secret weapon in the way the Germans imagined. Its secret was that there was no secret at all. It was just a truck that could swim, and in the final days of the war in Europe, that was more than enough. There are so many more of these incredible stories of ingenuity from the Second World War. If you'd like to make sure you don't miss our next deep dive, subscribing to the channel is the best way to stay in the loop.